Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, the late Christopher Hitchens, they're all known as the New Atheists, anti-God and anti-religion believers. Joining us now for what the movement is delivering and what it might not understand about religion, Amarnath Amarasingham, postdoctoral fellow at Dalhousie University and editor of Religion and the New Atheism, and Pamela Klassen, professor in the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. And it's great to have both of you here in our studios today. Amarnath, get us started. What is the New Atheism?
I mean, it's a tough kind of movement to define, but initially you can say it was a movement begun by the publications of books by those four individuals that you mentioned: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens. I think the clearest way to understand it is, their intent to kind of start a kind of secular revival of sorts. It's much more vibrantly anti-theist than previous movements in the past, but at the same time, in terms of new ideas, there aren't a whole lot. They cite all of the previous philosophers and seculars of the previous centuries and so on. But
well, let me go to Pamela with this.
Sure.
You've called it a movement. Do you think it's a movement?
I think it's more of a branding of a number of people, men, who've been pretty successful in getting their books out there as bestsellers, which is not to say the books aren't widely read and interestingly debated, but it is interesting. There's been a number of we could call them feminist critiques of why some of the women who've written books about the history of atheism, like Jennifer Hecht or Susan Jacoby, are not among this pantheon.
Somehow they didn't make it onto Mount Rushmore of this group.
They didn't.
What do you think's going on there?
I think those two books in particular are a little bit different. They're not so strident. They're not trying to make such provocative claims. They certainly don't use language around sexuality and gender in quite the same way as someone like Sam Harris does. And they're tracing longer histories. So they're not really out there to generate a movement in quite the same way. They're more out there to get people thinking about how have we thought about doubt? How have we thought about secularism in North America in particular, in Susan Jacoby's book? Interestingly
enough, like most conventional religions, it's very male-dominated. Why do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's been vibrant critiques within the movement itself. Like recently, the blog was written by Jennifer McCreight, who basically argued that this very point, that it's a white male-dominated movement, and she called for, not only just an inclusion of women and other kinds of individuals, but an actual embrace of some of the schools of thought of feminism, how to talk about gay and lesbian rights and these kinds of things within secularism as a movement, and they called it atheism plus, right? So it hasn't really caught on the same way new atheism has, but there is a kind of critique within the movement, and a very similar critique, I guess, of the Islamophobia sometimes within the movement, and springing from some of the clips that you've shown in previous shows about the bitter exchange between Sam Harris and Ben Affleck and those kinds of things. And so
on Bill Maher's show.
On Bill Maher's show, and the pushback to that kind of rhetoric. So there's been the new atheism, but then a whole kind of range of critiques within the movement about how to keep it kind of going, I guess.
Pamela, I'm going to read this quote from, this is Reza Aslan, whom I suspect you both know, writing in Salon. I'll get you to react to this first after I read it. It should be perfectly obvious, he writes, to all that these men do not speak for the majority of atheists. On the contrary, polls show that only a small fraction of atheists in the U.S. share such extreme opposition to religious faith. In fact, not only is the new atheism not representative of atheism, it isn't even mere atheism, and certainly is not new. What Harris, Dawkins, and their ilk are preaching is a polemic that has been around since the 18th century, one properly termed anti-theism. You think he's onto something here, that this is more anti-theism than atheism?
I tend to agree. I mean, the vast majority of the critiques of all four books are against theistic religions. And even Sam Harris, has admitted that he meditates, he likes spirituality. Dawkins has said that he has some kind of spiritual experiences when he looks at nature and the stars and so on. But their critique is primarily against the Western monotheistic religions and a kind of caricature of them in terms of what they look like and how they behave in public and those kinds of things. And so it is primarily an anti-theist movement. They're not talking about Buddhism or Jainism when they speak.
Let me read a couple of more things, because the two men you just mentioned actually, well, they've said infinitely more provocative things than those. For example, Richard Dawkins sees faith as, quote, one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus. Sam Harris has said, if I could wave a magic wand and get rid of either rape or religion, I would not hesitate to get rid of religion. How would you characterize this view of religion?
That last quote is particularly geared to just shocking people, I would imagine, because it's hard to say why we would put rape and religion in the same, as if something, first of all, he doesn't believe in magic wands, and second of all, why he would want to use those two as counterpoints is an interesting question. So I'm a scholar of religion. I do the study of religion as a human phenomenon.
Are you offended by that, though?
Oh, I'm totally offended by that statement. Yes, as a woman, as a mother, as a human being, I'm offended by that statement. But we could go into that. But let me say my thing about studying religion first. And what we do is think about how religion is a human phenomenon, but also how the word religion gets used in different kinds of ways, in different kinds of places, who gets to define it, why, how. And I think that's a great question to ask of these kinds of writings where the word religion is flying around very quickly and defining a lot of different things all at once, and you'd probably agree.
I think, I mean, we have to kind of keep in mind where the new atheism came from and what was happening in the United States and places like that at the time that these books were being written. So you're talking about post 9/11, post-war, the invasion of Iraq, post, all this kind of creation science debate that reared its head in the 2000s in Dover and the school board stuff. And so their version of religion that they're critiquing is colored by all of these kinds of events. So they pick on, much like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and other, they pick on the most extreme versions of religion as if it's the norm, and then critique it, right? And so this is why when I read these books, I find myself agreeing quite a bit of saying, okay, we don't want the Christian right involved in the climate change debate or something like that. I'm with you to a certain extent. The problem is the conflation of that with everything else, right? And so their argument that certain brands of religion shouldn't be influencing public policy is one thing, but the kind of conflation of it in terms of all religion is evil and more harmful than rape is a bit crazy.
That's part of the problem of thinking about religion as faith or belief. It leads us to not think about religion as family, as community, as the food you eat, as your approach to things like war, peace, pacifism, women's rights, these kinds of things. And so I think as someone whose work is the job of studying religion, it's always important to me to think about it both in the ways people practice it and in material forms.
Because I mean, for the new atheists, it's not religion is not about practice and lived religion, right? It's about a set of beliefs that are either testable scientifically or not. So for them, I mean, Richard Dawkins calls his book the God Delusion, and then Victor Stenger, who is kind of a new atheist, calls it God the Failed Hypothesis, right? And so they see it as a list of kind of testable hypotheses that scientifically you should be able to find proof about, and if there's no proof, then it's a failed hypothesis. And if you can't even test it because science is based on kind of empirical testing, then it's not scientific, right? And so they see it as a kind of intellectual exercise, and this is why they kind of venture into talking about religious people as either stupid or dangerous, because they see people as, you have a set of hypotheses that you have no evidence for, and you still continue to believe it, and therefore something must be wrong with you, right? And so they don't see it as a lived practice of community, of those kinds of things, which are just as, if not more important to how people live their life as religious people than just a bunch of things that you tick off on a box, right?
Gotcha.
And
just a few minutes to go here, and I want to use that time talking about what we are seeing rather frequently, namely the increasing tension between faith and public institutions. Pamela, get us started on this. The fault lines between these two seem to be as significant now as certainly as ever in our lifetimes. What do you think the most significant ones that you see are right now?
Again, I think I would probably not use the word faith, because I think one of the things that brings up controversy or tension, especially in legal context between public institutions and religious actors, is their practices, right? So clearly one of the most prominent ones is the wearing of the niqab, or even in some cases just veiling in general. I think there's a really interesting question that hasn't been fully articulated in religious terms, but question around debates around this new sex ed curriculum. It's not actually a sex ed curriculum. It's a healthy living and physical activity curriculum.
That's what it's called.
And if you read a lot of that curriculum, it makes seems like it makes a lot of sense, but then you see where people get upset is where it's around particular language used around children, and it's not so much around belief or not belief. It's around the practices of what people understand schooling to be about, which I think is a much bigger question around public education.
I had, Amarnath, a conversation recently with somebody who I can't identify, but who is a fairly significant player in the current government of Ontario. And this person told me that the current sex ed curriculum is wildly popular with the government's polling, but that those who are opposed to it are deeply, intensely opposed to it. Where does that get us as we try to figure these issues out in a kind of broad societal way?
Yeah, I mean, from in the context of this conversation, I think it's important, when we talk about secularism or the public, secularism in public, it's kind of like pouring oil out of a bottle, right? You never really get all of it. And the separation of religion and the public sphere is kind of like that. There's always a kind of residue of some religious principles that remain that people latch onto, and they never really feel, and this is why these things like the niqab and the hijab and the Charter of Values and these kinds of things pop up, because people, I think societies want that separation, but they also grew up in this culture, right? They grew up in a kind of cultural environment where they've internalized a lot of what Judeo-Christian principles that are still off limits for many people. And so when these kinds of policies start popping up, they get their backs up, right?
Well, Pamela, maybe you can help us understand this. In Quebec, they want a laïcité. They want a secular society. They don't want public servants to be able to wear veils or niqabs or that kind of thing. But they want the cross in the National Assembly.
Sure do. Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
how does that work exactly?
Well, I think Amarnath is right, that people are accustomed to religion, good religion, looking a certain kind of way, and being able to be in the background, on the speakers in the Quebec Assembly, without actually having to think about it as religion. So this is where, again, the question of what gets labeled religion, both in a way of something that's dangerous, but also sometimes it's a way of something that's our heritage. You have to think about how are those decisions made, and who's able to make them, who has the privilege to make them, which I think then gets us into the whole history of the development of Christianity within Canada, which in itself is a whole other topic, but a fascinating one.
Let's finish up on this. Pew Research, which I think you referenced earlier, showed in a recent public opinion survey that between 2007 and 2014, religious unaffiliation grew from 16% to just under 23%, so significantly larger. Given these numbers, Amarnath, let's start with you. Do you think we're going to see less conflict going forward between, I know you don't like the word faith, but what do you want me to call it? Between the religious and secular worlds, you want to call it that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a deeply kind of problematic Pew finding, because what you find is you have the kind of mainline Christians dropping off, and at the same time this bizarre none category, N-O-N-E category, on the rise, and we don't really know what that consists of. Some are atheists, a very small percentage, like 3% of Canadians identify openly as atheists, but the rest are this kind of nebulous spiritual but not religious, I kind of make my own spirituality worldview. And so you could, in a sense, and they tend to be much more liberal and tolerant, I guess, if you want to call it, so you could argue that with this kind of more inclusive spirituality, debates about things that are of religious practice, like the niqab and hijab and those kinds of things, may decline. It's tough to say, because very little is known about what the unaffiliated actually means, because there's a broad trend to not identify with any institutional religion, but we don't know where they go after, right? We don't know the decline. There's like a 7% drop, but we don't know where those 7% went.
So Pamela, if you had to sort of speculate on what this portends, where the religious and non-religious start being more equal in size as the decades move on, what are the implications of that, do you think?
Again, I'd say that the the approach of the survey asks people to identify as individuals. And that's one thing, that's really helpful information. But then we also have to think about how people remember their past, how people act as communities. And I think a great example is thinking about the recent Truth and Reconciliation report and thinking about how people are going to think about those stories told in that report and the recommendations made in that report, to think about what it means not only to be Canadian, but also what religion means in the history of Canada's past. So I think you learn one thing through asking people as individuals what they are, but you learn another thing from thinking about how religion is part of our history, is part of various kinds of communities in a more social kind of way.
Indeed. Thanks for this, you two. Pamela Klassen from the University of Toronto, Amarnath Amarasingam from Dalhousie University. Good to have both of you here in our studio tonight.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.